With military and government spending in question earlier today, I spoke with Peter Schiff. He's the CEO of Euro-Pacific Capital, and Walter Smolarek, an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Listen to them as they debate the deficit. Peter, I want to go to you first because Republicans are supposed to be the party of deficit hawks, yet now under Trump's first fiscal year in office, we've only seen a drastic increase in that deficit. What do you make of that?
Well, this is something that I predicted right after Trump was elected, that we would have huge deficits because there would be no opposition with the Republicans in Congress. Not that the Democrats would be any better. They would probably be worse. But, what's really disingenuous about the statistics that you just read, the government has all sorts of accounting gimmicks that it likes to use when it reports the budget, because a lot of the spending, they just conveniently classify it as off budget. But if you look at the increase in the national debt during the identical fiscal year, you'll see that the real debt increased by more than $1.2 trillion. So the government is actually borrowing 60% more than what it's pretending to borrow. So the actual increase in the debt is much larger than what everybody is talking about. So the problem is much bigger, and unfortunately it's going to get worse, especially with rising interest rates that make servicing that debt that much more expensive.
And Walter, as I outlined, most of the federal discretionary spending for the year 2018 was earmarked for the military. Do you think that's how Americans want their tax dollars spent?
Well, I think that's very unpopular. I mean, people want their tax dollars going to things that directly benefit them, things like schools, hospitals, roads, infrastructure, creating good-paying union jobs. And I think that the deficit has basically two primary reasons. One, there's the massive increase in Pentagon spending and just the enormous levels that that spending is at, which of course involves the official Department of Defense budget, but also things like overseas contingency operations and other ways to hide the true cost of war, and also the tax cuts. I mean, the tax cuts were a massive transfer of wealth from the poorest part of the population to big corporations, and I think that that's very, very apparent in those federal deficit numbers that you were talking about.
I'm going to ask this question to both of you, but let's stick with you first, Walter. Is the deficit as big of a problem as it's made out to be?
Well, I think that it depends on what that money is being spent for. In some circumstances, I think it could have the effect of stimulating the economy if it does things like, helping people afford rent, have affordable housing, education, different things that stimulate spending effectively. But what I think the tax cuts do is put more money into the pockets of people who are so unbelievably wealthy that they can't possibly spend all that money, and big corporations that are just going to use that money to do stock buybacks and other financial gimmicks.
Peter, it sounds like you disagree.
Well, first of all, tax cuts are not transfers of wealth. Wealth is transferred by taxation. So when you cut taxes, you're transferring less wealth, right? You're not taking money out of the pockets, or you're not putting money into the pockets of the rich. You're just taking less money out of the pockets of the rich. But the problem isn't the tax cuts. The problem is that government spending went up. It should have gone down. If you're going to make a decision to transfer less wealth, to steal less money from Peter to pay Paul, then you've got to cut your spending on Paul. But unfortunately, we didn't do that. The Republicans tried to have their cake and eat it too. They tried to transfer less wealth away from the people who earned it, but continue to give more money to people who didn't earn it. That is the problem. It is the government spending that we need to be opposed to. And government spending doesn't create economic wealth. It just transfers wealth, but in the process, it destroys it. You destroy the incentives to create wealth and to grow the economy. What we really need to be doing is shrinking the size of the federal government. We need dramatic cuts in government spending, but unfortunately, that is not what the Republicans are delivering. They are delivering more spending on welfare and on warfare, and so we have bigger deficits, and this is ultimately going to cause a massive problem.
But money just doesn't magically appear in rich people's pockets, right? I mean, people go to work every day. They work all day, sometimes 2 jobs, and that's where wealth comes from, right? It's not Jeff Bezos or Warren Buffett or Bill Gates or these three billionaires who have more money than half of the population combined. That's where wealth comes from. It's not some genius businessman.
That's where wages come from. The wealth comes from the entrepreneur. It comes from the savings and investment. The people who are collecting paychecks aren't creating the wealth. They are benefiting from the wealth that other people are creating. That's the beauty of capitalism. What your other guest is describing is a socialist nonsense. Well, the idea that it's the labor that creates the wealth. The labor benefits from the wealth that other people are creating. And government regulation and taxation inhibits the ability of the entrepreneur to create wealth.
I think what you're trying to say, Walter, is that the workers in these companies produce the wealth that runs the company. Am I?
Of course. I mean, look around.
Let's get Walter a chance to respond.
Well, of course. I mean, look around. Everything that you're wearing right now, everything in this studio, somebody built that, right? Somebody assembled it. Somebody went and mined or otherwise extracted the raw materials to create it. All of those things were done by workers who work for wages. Yeah, but those wages are less.
No, the workers just do the job that they're hired to do. The reason that we have all this stuff is because the workers have tools. They have capital that has been created by a free market. It's the saver and the investor that increases the productivity of labor.
So did Jeff Bezos go and build the factory himself?
Look, it's the investors, the workers. You don't build the economy from the workers up. That's just a bunch of nonsense. Anybody can show up and collect a paycheck. That is the easy part. What not everybody can do is write the paychecks, is to create a business from nothing, to organize the factors of production, to organize land, labor, and capital in such a way that you can satisfy the demands of the economy. The easiest thing you can do is show up and collect a paycheck. And it's very easy to pretend that the workers are responsible for all the wealth of the United States. They are not. They are just the principal beneficiaries of the free market economy that allowed the entrepreneur, the businessman, the employer to create all the wealth that workers and consumers benefit from.
Let me jump in because I have a question. How does this tie to the issue of government spending, Walter? If we're talking about tax cuts and money that corporations actually sometimes receive from the government, how does that fit into the debate here?
Well, I think that, the big question is government for who, right? What does the government spending actually do? And so I think that it can have the effect of redistributing some of that wealth, right, that was created, I believe, by employees, by labor, and take it from the pockets of Wall Street, of the CEOs, of the executives, and put a little bit of that money back into the pockets of ordinary people, providing for things that they need and that can actually only be accomplished through collective efforts, through, things like infrastructure spending, right? I mean, you can't go out and pitch in for, a highway or something like that. That has to be done by some collective entity.
Do you disagree with that, Peter? If Americans are receiving something actually tangible, like infrastructure with their tax dollars, would you be against that? Or you do believe that we're going to build roads and fund schools and do all of that based on the private market?
Well, first of all, very little money going to the federal government is going to build roads. I mean, that can be handled at the local level and should be done at the local level. But governments are very inefficient about satisfying the needs of individuals. Who's efficient is a private business that's trying to generate a profit and is subject to competition. So if you want things, you're going to get more things that you want from private businesses that have a vested interest in keeping costs down and quality up, rather than getting it from government bureaucrats whose only goal is to grow bureaucracy. Governments aren't good at raising living standards or increasing production. So the more wealth that we divert to government through taxation, the poorer we're all going to be. So if you want more stuff, if you want a higher standard of living, then you need to keep government to its absolute smallest size. What government should do is simply protect individual liberty, rights, and property. It's not there to redistribute the pie. It's there to allow capitalism to make the pie as big as possible so everybody has more to eat.
Well, we'll see what viewers have to say about this debate, whether they side with you, Peter, and think it's all top down, or Walter from the bottom up, and whether or not they think, their tax dollars, if they enjoy things like Social Security and Medicaid, if that's something they actually support the government spending on. So Walter Smolarek of the Answer Coalition and Peter Schiff, CEO of Euro Pacific Capital, thanks so much.